Section 21 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Liszt. The year 1811 was the year of the Great Comet, and in the autumn of that year, October 22nd, Franz Liszt was born in a tiny Hungarian village, Reding, where his father acted as steward for Prince Esterhazy, and consoled himself for his exile from any music but what he himself could produce by playing the piano every evening. Franz Liszt was an only child and very delicate. He listened to his father's music and was taught the piano by him. The only other music he heard was gypsy music, for Reding was lonely enough to have visits from bands of gypsies who in the evenings made wild, passionate music, dancing and singing with a rhythm and fervor all their own. Whenever a band of gypsies came to Reding, Franz Liszt went to listen to their music, at least when he was well enough, for at times his feeble constitution gave way under the instruction he received from his father and the village curé, and once he was even given up for dead, and the village carpenter began to make his coffin. Besides music, he had one other great interest as a child, an intense love of stories of the saints. This feeling lasted throughout his life, and was so strong that when his father died, Liszt wished to become a priest, and was only dissuaded by his confessor, who felt that his gifts for music should keep him in the world. Liszt's life was colored by these early impressions, and as he grew older his feelings for a saintly life became stronger. Yet at the same time he retained all his love for the gypsy dances he had heard in his youth performed in the open fields by the gypsies themselves, the men playing, the women with scarves and ribbons dancing and singing. They had made a vivid impression on Liszt when a sensitive child, and he never forgot them. After a successful concert at the near town of Eisenstadt when he was 9, he was taken by his father to Vienna, and 6 Hungarian noblemen subscribed to pay for his further musical education. In Vienna, Beethoven was living, and after one of Liszt's concerts, having heard him play and improvise, he mounted the platform and embraced him. It was not until some years later that Liszt completely attained his full powers as a pianist. He lived for some time in Paris, working at music. There his father died when he was 16. He then had a nervous breakdown and spent many months in complete seclusion with his mother, who had come to Paris to live with him. After this, while living quietly and not playing at all in public, he began to work at his piano, playing in a way all his own. After these special studies, passages that to other pianists would have been difficult, to him were easy. His playing was like a creation, as if he were composing the piece as he played, and his mastery and insight made his performance a revelation to those who heard it. He never played the same work twice in the same way. If he was persuaded to repeat a piece, he often felt it so differently from the way he had just played that his audience could hardly recognize the performance. Liszt was still quite young when he attained a wonderful position. All over Europe he was known and admired. He could make enormous sums of money by playing, and he often used his powers to raise money for charities, among others for the people rendered homeless by the Danube floods in 1837, and for a monument to Beethoven in Bonn. Such a life as he led, playing frequently, traveling from town to town, everywhere welcomed as a pianist whose playing was like magic to his audiences, such a life would have seemed complete and almost intoxicating to most men. To Liszt, it was only the apprenticeship to the work he felt he had to do, to compose music himself and to help other musicians whose work realized his ideals. At the age of 35, he gave up his career and retired to the little German town of Weimar to become conductor of the orchestra there. He remained to the end of his life a pianist of such gifts his playing seemed unique to his hearers. But after he went to Weimar, he never again played to make money for himself. His life thenceforward was devoted to producing the work of other composers and composing himself. Weimar, which had been famous when Goethe and Schiller lived there, now became famous again when Liszt produced year after year new operas and new orchestral works, many by men then unknown, but destined to become well known, and whose earliest fame was due to his interest in their music and his efforts to produce it. His sympathies were wide, and he gave as much effort to producing works by the great masters who preceded him as he did to gaining a hearing for new works. He it was who first revived Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was then neglected and misunderstood. Liszt felt that such a work demanded a far higher standard of performance than orchestras of his day ever gave. Differences of light and shade, beauties of phrasing, and such details were essential to a true performance, and he drilled his orchestra and chorus with such perseverance that wonderful results were attained, unthought of by ordinary conductors. He gave all Mozart's operas works by Palestrina and Lasso, choosing compositions which he admired and felt he could recreate in performance. People flocked from all over the world to Weimar for these performances, and composers like Berlioz and Wagner, then struggling against adverse circumstances, found themselves becoming known owing to Liszt's efforts. Liszt had a great imagination for the possibilities of new sounds. His friends were amazed at his liking to improvise on an out-of-tune piano when he came across one. To them the sounds of such an instrument would have been ugly and discordant, but they acknowledged that when Liszt experimented in this odd way, he seemed able to show how such sounds could be turned to beautiful use, and his hearers enjoyed the strange new beauties he produced. It was not only in sound that Liszt was a prophet of the future. He realized that music could not be tied to certain shapes and forms, and he found new freedom, letting it express poetical feelings without any of the old fixed design. No one can hear his orchestral work called Orpheus without feeling that a being with divine feeling appears, passes by, and vanishes. And again, anyone who hears his work Mazeppa feels the tragic storm followed by calm and then rising again in triumph. The music, besides realizing the poetic conception of each of these heroes, also conveys vivid feelings of a definite and moving kind. Such a work is called a symphonic poem, and the shape depends on the feeling to be expressed. New combinations of sound, new successions of sounds, new shapes, new ethereal feelings expressed in sound, all these we owe to Liszt. The greatest of his contemporaries, Berlioz and Wagner, knew this, and all who came after Liszt owes him something. Wagner acknowledged how much he owed to Liszt's music, as well as to his generosity and friendship. The most famous of Liszt's works are his Faust Symphony, his Dante Symphony, his symphonic poems, and his sacred works, Saint Elizabeth and Christus. These were almost all written during the 12 years he spent at Weimar. There, at a house on the Altenburg, he had several rooms for working and playing. In one stood 3 pianos, one of them the piano that had belonged to Mozart. In another were more pianos. One was a Broadwood, which had belonged to Beethoven, and which was the last on which he had played before his death. Liszt himself preferred playing on an Erard, and had several Erard pianos in the house. He only used Mozart's and Beethoven's pianos on some special occasions. During these years he devoted the mornings to his own writing, but the rest of the day he was surrounded by pupils and musicians, or else he was conducting. New works such as Wagner's operas then seemed unintelligible until Liszt's patience and teaching made the players understand exactly what the music meant and how it was to be performed. Great musicians have always been able to recognize greatness in others and welcome it, but no musician has shown greater generosity of feeling than Liszt. He was unmindful of the success of his own work, provided he could help forward the work of other musicians whose music he considered worthy. Time has proved how right was his choice of what was good. The list of works he produced at Weimar contains names that have almost all become famous and all of which have original beauty. 10 years before Berlin or any other German town would produce the operas of Wagner, Liszt was making some of them well known at Weimar. He had worked hard, too, at making Beethoven's music well known, and some years before, when Beethoven died and his works were much disliked in Paris, Liszt insisted on playing his concertos and sonatas there until he won for them the regard and esteem we now give as a matter of course. Contemporaries who heard Liszt said it was impossible to describe his playing. Schumann's wife, herself a famous pianist, wrote with wonder to Schumann of Liszt's performance when she first heard him, and his powers were unimpaired to the end of his life. In 1886 he came to England and played. His fame was so great that it was like a legend. As the audience waited in the hall, they heard a roar coming along the street. It was waiting crowds applauding as Liszt passed, on his way to the hall to play. Later in life, Liszt joined the Order of St. Francis of Assisi. He was sometimes called Abbé Liszt, but his vows left him free to marry and live as he liked in the world, only binding him to certain religious observances which had always been dear to him. The last years of his life he divided his time between Budapest, Weimar, and Rome, spending a few months in each, and occasionally visiting Bayreuth, where his daughter Cosima lived, for she was Wagner's second wife. It was at Bayreuth that he died of weakness on July 19, 1886. Liszt's orchestral works and his great powers as a pianist are not his only claims to fame. All his life he wrote works for the piano which extend the powers of the instrument and which are full of originality. His one sonata has passages of great beauty with new and unexpected sounds. The shape is not like what is usually called a sonata, for it is all in one long movement. His Années de Pèlerinage are books of pieces, some of the later ones so simple that only a great artist can play them with sufficient insight to create again the feeling with which Liszt wrote them. His transcriptions of songs and parts of operas are like a commentary on the music and add to our understanding of the works he chose to transcribe. Much of Liszt's music is still too little known. He wrote over 1,000 pieces for the piano, and some of the most beautiful are seldom played, while the works that are played in public are often those that are very difficult to the ordinary pianist, so that they are apt to give an impression of difficulty rather than of beauty. This is because these works need a performer of attainments like Liszt himself, so that the difficulties seem easy and become only part of the poetical feeling that is being expressed. The beautiful orchestral works of Liszt, too, are not often performed. His Faust Symphony, Dante's Symphony, and symphonic poems are all full of individual beauties, clear and lovely effects of sound, making definitely beautiful impressions. But though it is not possible often to hear Liszt's works performed, it is possible to know a good deal of his life and his generosity of character. Incapable of petty feelings or of jealousy, he worked for all he thought worthy in music, both old and new, undeterred by ill feeling on the part of those who should have appreciated his efforts, and not troubling whether his own work was produced. His life was full and vivid. During his years in Paris, he was on terms of intimacy with Chopin, George Sand, Heine, and many other famous artists and writers. In Weimar, his house was open to people of all classes and every nation. Wagner and Berlioz were his great friends, while his powers and his personality attracted people of all degrees and assured him an enthusiastic welcome wherever he went. He gave his powers and his position to the service of ideals in art for which he worked unceasingly. End of section 21 of Music by Ursula Creighton. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 27, 2024.